In every movement, there have been activists who have fought tirelessly for racial justice.
Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
In this series, we dive into the lives of activists who stood on the front lines of two pivotal eras of the Black liberation movement, the Civil Rights Movement.
The church is always supposed to be the safe sanctuary if you're sitting in there. But we were amazed while we were in there.
And the uprisings following the tragic death of Mike Brown.
We've seen officers respond in such a heavy way that dogs out, tanks, tear gas, M16s, like this was Iraq.
For these activists, what was there to gain? Or, better yet, what was there to lose in their fight for freedom? On this episode, from protesting to politics in the 1960 Civil Rights Movement. Welcome to I Bear Witness, Freedom Fighters on the Front Line. I'm your host, Tiffany Lee, and today we have Mr. Virvus Jones. Virvus Jones is a St. Louis City leader. He started out as a young paperboy in the 60s, reading the headlines and stories about the civil rights movement happening throughout the country. He was drafted into the military during Vietnam and ultimately became the 11th Black alderman for the city of St. Louis. As a young man, he was over the largest area of St. Louis City. He was later appointed as the comptroller of the city of St. Louis and was then elected to this position 2 times. As a city leader, he always fought for social and economic justice for his constituents. Welcome to the show, Mr. Jones.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you for coming. I'll start out with, how did you start out in the movement?
Well, my first activist activity was in the Jefferson Bank demonstrations back in 1963. This was a demonstration. The Jefferson Bank demonstration was a protest against job discrimination at Jefferson Bank. They weren't hiring any. They had no African American employees, but they had a lot of African American businesses and deposits. And so a group of organizations, the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, some elected officials got together and decided to start a picket at Jefferson Bank in around August of 1963.
Okay.
Well, subsequently the bank got an injunction against them picketing and protesting, and they started arresting some of the adult protesters and put them in jail. And as they would, back then, if you got arrested, you had to get bailed out. So when they put these certain protesters' the adults' names on a list and said that they would be violating a court injunction if they protested, they came to schools and recruited high school students who were basically juveniles and had us to come out and protest. And so there was one day I was coming out of school with some friends, and a Democratic committeeman from the 18th Ward named Fred Weathers, who owned a cab company, was also part of the protest, had cabs lined up outside the school and said, hey, do you all want to go protest? And so I had been reading about all the protests in the South and the freedom rides and the sit-ins, and so I decided that, hey, maybe this is time for me to get involved. So a bunch of us jumped in the cabs and went down to Jefferson Bank. And when we got down there, we were down there probably about 15, 20 minutes, and we were arrested. And but for a juvenile, all you needed was your parent to come down and get you if you were under the age of 17.
So how old were you?
I was 16.
Okay.
So my mother came down. She worked actually at the Crown Cafe, which was on the corner of Franklin and Jefferson, which is now Martin Luther King and Jefferson, which was about 2 blocks from the bank.
Okay.
But I was in jail, and my cousin, who was a captain at the time, James Reddick, was on the force, and so he called my mom and told her, and she came down and got me. And so I did it twice. And the second time she told me, she said, look, I can't keep leaving my job to come down and pick you up. So that was my first foray into protest, and that was 1963.
Okay. And 63 was a pivotal year in the civil rights movement.
Yes,
correct?
that's because it was a time when in Mississippi,
Emmett Till.
No, not Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed in the 50s, but
Medgar Evers.
Medgar Evers was
Yeah.
assassinated. He was president of the Mississippi chapter, NAACP, and he was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. Then you had the March on Washington was in August, and Jefferson Bank demonstration was in the same month.
Okay.
And then in September, the 5 girls were killed in Birmingham,
Church.
Alabama, in the church and bombing.
church
And then
bombing.
you had also, that was the year that John Kennedy was assassinated.
Okay.
So all of this was packed into a year for me that
Wow.
was pretty pivotal and kind of like one of those epiphany years, where you say, you got to start paying attention to what's going on in the world,
Mm-hmm.
And I was a pretty precocious child in the sense that I read a lot and asked a lot of questions and I grew up in the South. 'Cause I was born in Memphis, and my family lived in Tallahatchie County, which was the county and the area that Emmett Till was killed in '55.
Yeah.
And we left the South in '56.
Okay. There's a new book written about Emmett Till's death called Airborne. It's actually, I've started reading it. The barn where he was killed is actually still there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was never taken out. And I guess after so long, people
Yeah.
kind of even forgot that was the place.
Oh wow.
Right?
I know because my family is from a place called Webb, Mississippi, and Marks, Mississippi, which is right next to Sumner, Mississippi, which is the courthouse
Okay.
that
Where
Emmett
they were
Till was
tried.
where his murderers were tried and found not guilty.
Right. And then they later confessed in the magazine.
right.
What year was it? How old were you when you were drafted into the Vietnam War?
I was 19.
Okay. And what was that like?
Well, it was it was a frightening. Actually, it was like one of those things where you just you get drafted and you just did what you were supposed to do. I mean, I wasn't even thinking in terms of not going. And I really didn't know that much about the Vietnam War at the time. That was like 1960, latter part of '65.
Really?
And so I didn't really know. I mean, I read about it in the paper, but it just seemed like a very distant kind of place. And the United States at that time, it had not escalated to a point where we had occupied forces there. I think the first actual military unit that went there in like the summer of 1965. That was the 173rd Airborne Division. And so, being 19 and silly, I joined I volunteered to become a paratrooper.
Oh, really?
and became part of the 82nd Airborne Division, and was dispatched to Vietnam in 1966, and spent 13 months there, and came home in 67, and got out in 68, latter part of 67.
Wow, I mean, this short time, 5 years, you
Oh yeah, right.
been through major things.
Fast forward to 1968, that was, I'd gotten out of the Army, I think, latter part of 67, and started working at the post office in 1968 when I started back to school. And April, Martin Luther King gets assassinated.
Oh, wow.
Which really kind of like was another, one of those, times of life, where you start, thinking about what are you doing,
Right.
And at that time, Martin Luther King had started protesting against the Vietnam War because we had found out that he was a revealing stat that 40% of the combat soldiers or the soldiers assigned to combat units in Vietnam were African Americans. So when people would say, why was why was the civil rights movement getting involved in the war? And Martin Luther King said it is a civil rights movement because, there are young people dying in Vietnam who are not free here.
Right.
Who don't have full civil rights in the United States. And the average age of a soldier in Vietnam was 19. So
wow.
if you think 40% of the soldiers are African American and the average age is 19, that's a lot of young people dying.
Yeah, a lot of young black men.
A lot of young black men dying.
Yeah.
And it was all black men at that time, yeah. And so, I got involved, I got involved in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Okay. And we started protesting against the war, and I went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year and saw the police riot against the protesters. That was the same year that Fannie Lou Hamer and her group, the Freedom Party of Mississippi, were protesting the way delegates were selected to the Democratic National Convention. So all of this was going on. I mean, from 63 to 68 was just a really, and then we elected Richard Nixon as president at the same time. So all of this was going on. It was a really interesting time. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And I was 21 years old. I mean, 21. We went from 16 to 21,
wow.
So that was a...
And so you were in school. What school were you going to?
I was at Forest Park Community College. It had just opened. I was right down the street here on Oakland. And I started there using my GI Bill benefits.
Right.
And we started doing some protests against the war. And I think October the 15th, they had a national moratorium where, we were supposed to pause and kind of like the movement wanted us to take advantage of, people to kind of pause and think about the war and have teach-ins and things like that to talk about the war and how the misinformation about the war had gotten out about why we were there and the fact that, we were in a war we were not going to win. Mm-hmm. And so people were really trying to put out information to try to get the United States to pull out of the war, because it was escalating at that time. I think about that time was when it went from you had in 1968 you had Tet, which was like the Tet offensive happened in February of 1968. Tet is the Chinese New Year or the Chinese celebration of New Year in February. Mm-hmm. Well, the Vietnamese had a offensive that year, and 10,000 soldiers died within that 1 month period. Wow. And 10,000 American soldiers, more than had died previously in the entire time they'd been in Vietnam, which would have been about 10 years at that time.
I didn't know that. I guess what happened?
Well, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong just kind of surprised everybody, and on New Year's, on the Asian New Year's, they just attacked all different places in Vietnam. They just started they call it the Tet Offensive. Okay. And if you Google it, you'll find out, that they attacked all kind. Now, they say the Viet Cong lost 100,000 soldiers, but we lost 10,000. Mm. And that kind of changed a lot of people's thinking about, what we were doing, because we were telling people that we were advisors, but we actually had military units there. Then the number of soldiers escalated to 500,000 in Vietnam at one time. Oh, wow.
So you guys had this national moratorium on the campus, and what exactly did you guys do?
Well, originally the school had agreed to let us raise the flag to half-mast in memory of the soldiers who had died there, and that we would have a ceremony in front of the flag. Well, they changed their mind and told us we couldn't, and so we said, well, we don't recognize that we can't. So we attempted to raise the flag to half-mast, and the security and police came and said, no, you're not going to do it, and somehow the flag got torn. A bunch of us got arrested and were charged with, initially charged with desecration of a flag, but that's not really a law. Mm. So they charged us with destruction of school property, to wit, the flag.
Okay.
So they charged about 5 of us with that, and we went to municipal court, and it's a misdemeanor, but they fined me $3,700, and at that time, if you got fined and you didn't have the money, you had to work it off at the workhouse. That's what they call it, the workhouse, at $2 a day.
Oh wow!
So
Right.
so unless I could appeal it, you know.
Right.
So a bunch of us decided that we were going. Well, me personally, I said I'm going down to the bus station. I'm going to Chicago and go to Canada. 'Cause
Right.
I'm not going to spend that time in jail.
Because I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but I mean, I'm thinking it was like 7+ years.
Well,
if
it's
it's
a long.
$2,
I didn't even do the math. You know, I said
right.
it was not something I was going to do. So
exactly.
you know, I didn't have $3,700. You know, and $3,700 was a lot of money. So one of the guys' father came down. Bruce Langell, his father had some money. He came down and wrote a check and. For our bond, you had to put up 10% of it, you know, to bail everybody out. It was 5 of us, you know, so he bailed us out.
That's good.
And so then we appealed it, and our lawyers won on the appeal.
Okay. So did he get his money back then?
No, I don't know. I don't bail bond money. You don't get the 10% back. No.
Okay.
You just don't get, you know, because you don't put up the whole amount. You just you get the bail bondsman 10%, and he basically guarantees the $3,700 or your appearance in court
to make sure that you come.
Right.
So how did you end up? You're a young person. You come out in '63, starting at 16. You go in the Vietnam War, then you're objecting to the war. How do you end up in politics?
Well, I at the same time, 1968 was the year that Bill Clay, Congressman Bill Clay, was running as the first black congressman from the state of Missouri.
He was in the movement,
and
too.
he was in the Jefferson Bank movement, and I knew some of those people, and so I worked on his campaign at the same time. And worked on, and so I got familiar with Gwen Giles, who was his campaign manager, who also became a state senator, first black woman to become a state senator in the state of Missouri, and also she was the first black assessor in the city of St. Louis. So I knew her, and I knew Pearl. I knew the whole. So I worked on several of his campaigns from about 1968 till about 1979. Then they encouraged me to run for alderman in the 6th Ward, and I lost pretty badly, and I decided I need to find some place I could win. So I looked around and moved. I got a job essentially out in the 27th Ward at the Walbridge Community School as community school coordinator or principal of the community school, working for the Board of Education. And then I decided to run for committeeman and alderman in that ward, and then. And at the same time, in all this process, Homer Phillips Hospital had closed. So I decided to run for alderman at that time when Jim Conway, who was the mayor in I think in 1980, closed the hospital in North St. Louis.
What's the significance of Homer Phillips Hospital?
Well, Homer Phillips Hospital was a black hospital, the hospital for blacks that was built in 1938. It opened in 1938. And it was essentially the hospital that educated probably half of the doctors in this country at one time. Okay. Because there was only 2 hospitals that black physicians could intern. And that was a hospital in New York, Harlem Hospital, and a hospital here in St. Louis. So half of the doctors, at one point, half of the doctors in the world were coming out of St. Louis. Because that was the only place you could intern. You couldn't intern at Barnes or Jewish. I mean, you know, and blacks didn't even go to Barnes, a Jewish hospital. So we had a black public hospital and a white public hospital. There was City Hospital number 1, which was located over on Lafayette, and right at Lafayette and 14th Street. And you had Homer Phillips, which was located on Whittier in North St. Louis in the Ville area next door to Sumner High School.
So that you run with the hopes of?
Well, Vince Schaefer was running for mayor, and a lot of us who were part of the protest to try to keep Homer Phillips Hospital open, I ran for alderman at the same time against an alderman or against an alderman's organization that had voted to close the hospital.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so we were trying to knock off those people, and Ben Shamel was running with the promise that he was going to reopen the hospital, and subsequently he didn't. And so that was my entry into in '79. It was about that, and so we wanted to get more members on the board of aldermen so we could possibly get them to refund it. But the further we got away from it, the harder it was to do, because Home of Phillips was built when they had wards in the hospital. They didn't have private rooms. Well, the hospital accreditation people have said if you built new hospitals, you had to build them with private rooms, 2 people to a room.
Right.
And the ward hospital thing was if you had a ward hospital, you got grandfathered in. But if you didn't, if you reopened it, if it closed, you had to reopen it with private rooms. So the conversion was extremely expensive. It was going to cost $60-70 million.
Oh, wow.
So they put a bond issue on the ballot that didn't pass. And so people got pissed off at Vince Shamel. So ultimately, Gwen Giles passed away. Vince Shamel appointed me assessor to replace her in an attempt to try to placate some of his political problems he had at that time with Bill Clay and some other elected officials who were still pissed off because he had closed Home of Phillips Hospital. And subsequently, in 1986, he closed City Number 1 also, so there was no public hospital in the city of St. Louis. And so this pissed off a lot of people, made them a lot angry. And so I was seen as a olive branch because Bill Clay and I still were allies, even though I was working for Vince Shamel. Vince Shamel then cut a deal for me to swap my job. Paul Bearer was the comptroller, I was the assessor. So Paul Bearer decided he didn't want to be a comptroller anymore for a lot of reasons that we don't have time to go into. But so I swapped jobs. I went from the assessor to the comptroller, and Paul became the assessor. And then I ran for election. I was appointed in November and ran for election initially in '89 and got reelected in '93.
Question, besides Homer G. Phillips being important as far as educating Black doctors, what is the importance of the hospital to the North City corridor? Well,
the importance of the hospital was that it was located in an area of North St. Louis called the Ville.
Okay.
And in that area, you had Annie Malone's Children's Home, which is still there. Sumner High School was right next door to it. You had Home of Phillips Hospital. Then you had what's called a Poro School. You had Poro School of Beauty, the beautician school, which was all founded by Annie Malone.
Yes.
And that was basically kind of like the commercial, economic, cultural center of North St. Louis at the time. And also including, there was Stowe Teachers College, which after '54 merged with Harris and became Harris Stowe. So you had all these institutions there. And what people don't understand about institutions, especially governmental institutions, a lot of times economic activity, it depends on, is predicated by where government, invests its money. For instance, WashU probably represents WashU and BJC and all of that complex up there. That's about 18 to 27,000 jobs. Okay. So not-for-profits or governmental facilities a lot of times create, the kind of economic impetus for things that will be located. For instance, where you put government office buildings, where you locate them. That's people living there. NGA is a classic example.
Right, that's what I was going to say. NGA is a current example of that.
Exactly.
Everybody was worried about exactly where it would be placed in the city.
Because of the economics. NGA right now is located in South St. Louis, but it generates 3,000 employees. It generates about $4 million a year in earnings taxes. So, and then, but when you talk about just NGA, then the ancillary things around it, the restaurants, the other services, all of that's part of the economic activity. So we were looking at Homer Phillips in more than just a historic, context of being a place that had educated all these doctors. It's also healthcare. I mean, and public healthcare was free public healthcare.
Right.
I mean, all these public hospitals had been created, during the bird flu back in 1918 because the private hospitals wouldn't serve public people. So Max Starkloff who was a famous doctor that city number 1 is named after, was actually the doctor they said to save the country from was like Dr. Fauci.
Okay.
Back at that time, in terms of innovating ways to save people keep people from dying from the flu.
Yeah. So I guess you weren't able to save Homer G. Phillips. What do you think were some wins that you did have as an elected official?
I go back and forth with wins, because most of the stuff that I think that we won, a lot of it's been peeled back. It's like I thought we were on a trail of equity and trying to create more opportunity. But if you look at what happened in North St. Louis, I'm not sure that we got a lot of wins because we were not able to repopulate that area. We were not able to get enough impetus because the city unfortunately developed what I call a triage program for development. And I don't know if triage is in medical terms is where you treat, where you go into a clinic, you treat.
We got the bandage here.
Right, if a guy's got a sucking chest wound, you stabilize him or her. And if you got a cut bandage, it's military. In other words, if a guy comes into a dispensary and you want to treat the person that's most likely to survive first. Mm-hmm. Then you treat the person that has the less chance of survival. Okay. And so you triage them. You put them in and so we felt that what the city did was came with what we call a reverse triage program for development in the city of St. Louis, because they said that they were going to treat the Central Corridor, this part of the city, because this was the part of the city that still had some, chance of survival. And they thought there was going to be this explosion out, that if you saved the Central Corridor, that would help North St. Louis. Well, we said that doesn't make any sense, because if you deal with saving the near south side and the north, this central would naturally grow because you have an implosion as opposed to an explosion. Okay. And they came with a plan called Team 4. And it was never adopted, but it was adopted unofficially. The government basically just said that they were not going to invest into these areas. Closing Homer Phillips Hospital. At one time you had 3 hospitals in North St. Louis. Now, and a lot of this had to do with where the economy was going to. St. Louis lost from 1950 to the year 2010, we lost 500,000 people in the city of St. Louis. The population was 820,000 people, and we have in 2010 we had 319. Wow. 301,000. I'm not even sure what it was, but lost 500,000 people over a 70-year period, over 7 decades, which means that, that's a lot of people. Now they moved into St. Louis County and other places. Right. Yeah, but they followed development. I mean, the developers decided that they were not going to invest in North St. Louis. They were going to invest everywhere, and they basically said that. So they took all government incentive and they put it in the city of St. Louis, especially. They invested into the Central Corridor, an area between, I think, I'm saying Highway 44 and Highway 40 at Delmar. That's where that famous Delmar Divide comes. Right. Because if you look, and so when I say wins, I'm not sure that we had too many wins, because if I look at what the results were, St. Louis is not, did not move in that sense. We're still losing population. It's not bleeding as much as it was, but it's still losing. In the whole region, though, and I think a lot of that had to do with other regions. Like in 1981, I visited Atlanta. Maynard Jackson was a friend of mine, and I visited him and just to find out what they were doing there, because they just built their new airport. They had 1.5 million people in the St. Louis in the Atlanta metropolitan area. So now there's 6 million people in the Atlanta metropolitan area because they were able to, Maynard had a phrase called too busy to hate.
Okay.
Because he said, look, if we're going to grow, let's make sure everybody grows.
I think that in this area, a big part of the problem is race. People move,
right.
But also the reason why they don't want to become a part of
right.
St.
You got
Louis
22
City.
school districts in St. Louis City. You got 22 fire districts. You got 60 police departments.
In this
have in places like Chicago, you got one Chicago police department. You got a county police department in Memphis. That's not saying they are necessarily doing 1,000% better than we are, but they don't have all the duplication of services that we are. They said that we spend in the city of St. Louis, in St. Louis County spends $1 billion a year in duplication of services.
Yeah.
So when you look at but we can't annex because we are a county, and St. Louis is a county. St. Louis County is a county.
I know, but that's what I was saying. It's like we've tried to become whole, but it seems like in some ways race plays a role into that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
1954 was kind of a pivotal point when Brown versus Board, and that's when the white flight occurred, and you started creating all these white school districts. You didn't have them before. So now you've got 22 school districts, and your education, your quality education is determined by your zip code.
So let me ask you this. So it seemed like when you came in, there was a lot going on. You had William Lacey Clay, senior elected, yourself was elected, a lot of African-American aldermen. And then we rescinded some. And then after the Ferguson protests and everything like that, it seemed like a pendulum swung the other way. We had a lot of black officials, young people with different ideas to get elected, right? But in some ways, it seems like already, this is 10 years, the pendulum is swinging back.
Well, I couch it in two different, in two things that create that to a certain extent. One is white fear, and the other one is black expectations.
Okay.
Black people, and people have an expectation when we go out and we make these promises as elected officials that we're going to change something. Well, in the day, this day of internet, people are looking at Instagram and people are looking for instant change. And so you got that black expectation out there that, well, why aren't things changing? You say you're going to change it. Well, government doesn't move like the government moves like an aircraft carrier. You're trying to move, it moves slow.
Right.
And but the expectation that we created, by giving people that, saying, well, things are going to change. We're electing these people. We're electing the Cori Bushes, and they're excited. But we forgot that the other people didn't go away. They just, the
people that didn't want change.
Right. When the status quo just said, we'll just wait. And they have more patience. And they then they know how to exploit white fear. And so they say, look, here, they used it before is that black people are going to move into your neighborhoods. Now it became transgender, and then it became, gay rights, and it became, all of these things, all these cultural things that people are going to be doing to you when they move into your neighborhoods, and so, and look, and despots have been able to exploit fear, throughout the ages, and unfortunately, fear, as Machiavelli would say in one of his books, The Prince and the Discourses, and he wrote back in the 15th century, fear is a stronger motivator than love.
Wow.
You know, it always has been. You know, and he asked the question. He said, "If you're a prince, would you rather have your constituency fear you or love you?" Well, the answer is fear, because fear is much more penetrating. It has much more of an impact on people. Whereas love, I tell people, you fall in love every day. You know, you can see somebody today and tomorrow, and love is not as sustaining. And fear is.
I would agree with that. I've always talked about, I felt like Obama, he ran on hope, and Trump ran on hate.
Yes, he did.
And it was kind of the flip side. That's the fear,
right, it's the fear.
Or the love. But what would you say, you know, to close us out? What would you say needs to be done to continue our forward progress? The work that you guys have done, the work that was done in Ferguson. How do we keep moving forward to actually make change in this area?
Well, I think we have to understand that it's a marathon and it's not a sprint.
Okay.
You know, I mean, and this is still our system of government is still an experiment. I mean, we look around the world and I'll use World War II as an example and World War I. Between those two periods of time in Europe, just 100 million people were killed in 2 wars. Well, after that, the British and the Europeans said, are we going to keep doing this? Or are we going to create a more equitable society? So they went socialist. They created a safety net. They created universal health care. They said because it's harder to use fear if people feel their basic needs are being taken care of.
Right. Final words for those, you know, you got a lot of people now, they're like, once Trump was reelected, I'm done. Okay, I've seen a lot of things where people are like, okay, black women, it's time for us to take a self-care time.
Well, the pendulum always shifts.
Okay.
I mean, that's what people. I mean, I think, yeah, it's hard. I mean, I hear all of these people saying, these people in Trump's circles saying what they're going to do, but you see what's happening. On Monday they say we're closing down. On Tuesday they got reopened because it's more difficult than they think it is. I mean, our bureaucracy, we're going to lay off 2 million people. Well, really? I mean, and then who's going to do the work? You're going to lay off air traffic controllers. We're going to privatize air traffic controllers. I said, do you want airlines to be the ones controlling safety for airlines? Do you want that to be a bottom line thing? Because they're saying we can do it cheaper. Well, it's cheap. I don't. It's not
necessarily safe.
That's right. I got LASIK surgery about 25 years ago, and they had these different companies like Clarkson. I shouldn't cut the name, but some they saying $700 an eye. Well, there was a guy at WashU who invented this LASIK surgery, and he said it was $2,000. So I said, I'm going with the $2,000 guy because this is my eye. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we can't get into this thing of like what things cost because and that's where we are. We get into that point where we're kind of like putting things in like, this is what costs, so we shouldn't be doing this. Government can't have a bottom line. I mean, government wouldn't create. If government started operating, business is going to have bottom lines. Government, if you're talking about healthcare and those things, and we live in a society where everything costs.
Right.
So we're either going to have to pay for those things, or we're going to have to give people money to pay for them.
Right.
Or they're going to say people are going to die, like what happened in COVID. I mean, we were not ready, and that's not the first. I don't think we've gone past the first or the last pandemic.
Right. I would agree. Well, Mr. Jones, thank you for coming in. And it seems like that your note to the audience is, no matter what people try to do, it can't be done as easily as they think it is. And don't give up.
And
is
don't
that
give
the
up.
message?
Well, I'm 78, so don't give
you
up.
Still here? Right.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.